The best solution to climate change would be a nuclear winter.
Article 109 is a provision in the Charter of the United Nations that says that a majority of the General Assembly can call for a convention where the Charter would be revisited.
I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, the editor of UN Dispatch. This September, the United Nations is hosting the Summit of the Future, and it is intended to revive the multilateral system in general and the United Nations in particular. If all goes according to plan, world leaders will endorse a so-called Pact for the Future that will serve as a vehicle for enacting key reforms to the United Nations. In late January, negotiations began in earnest over what will be included in that Summit of the Future outcome document. My guest today, Dan Perel, has been following this process very closely. He serves as a representative for the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office. We spoke not long after the so-called zero draft of the Pact for the Future was released. This is the draft that will serve as the basis for negotiations going forward. Today's episode is produced in partnership with the Baha'i International Community at the UN and other international forums, where it says that recognizing humanity's interconnectedness is key to a shared global future. Where did this idea come from, and why is the Secretary General seemingly so invested in it?
The seeds actually for the Summit of the Future were planted a number of years ago. And I'll just go back to 2020, which was the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, when the member states had a commemoration of that anniversary. And in it, they produced a declaration, an outcome document. The very last paragraph called on the Secretary General to report back before the end of that session of the General Assembly with recommendations to advance what they said was our common agenda and to respond to current and future challenges. So in that document, 1 year later produced by the Secretary General, he called for 3 summits to take place. Now, member states had a little bit of trouble agreeing about the precise date of the Summit of the Future, so they agreed on putting it in 2024. We are at the point now in January, February 2024, when we have 8 months before the summit. We've promised on an outcome document, and the member states sort of have to make it happen. And the zero draft just came out a couple days ago, and now we're in the process of figuring out what the Pact for the Future will say and what kind of commitments the member states are prepared to make.
I'm interested in having you explain and discuss what you perceive to be the role of civil society groups like the Baha'i International Community in helping to move this process along and achieve a meaningful outcome.
What civil society can do, I think, is speak a little bit more to the zeitgeist of the day, can say, if you're going to pledge a new beginning in international cooperation with a new approach, well, here's a new approach. These are some ways that we would imagine the world can be bettered. You articulate global solidarity. Here's how global solidarity can find expression in international governance. Civil society can use something like the Summit of the Future as a hook to offer new ideas and new thinking, and maybe something will stick. That's one dimension, is sort of that aspirational, visionary dimension. The Baha'i International Community has been asked to serve as a co-chair of this coalition called the Coalition for the UN We Need, which, since the process of the 75th anniversary of the UN, has been looking at the UN we need. Essentially, rather than taking the UN as it is and seeing what to advance, also looking at what it is humanity needs today and figuring out how we can get there. So this is a large coalition of civil society around the world. We are trying to articulate our own parallel People's Pact, if you will. It's not like civil society is monolithic and has agreed on a path forward itself. But I think that there's a dimension to which what we are trying to do at the BIC, and perhaps even with the coalition, is to find those areas where there are points of consensus and to explore them further. There's a convening power that civil society has on certain issues of interest to various member states, and then we can create a space where solutions can emerge and new thinking can emerge. I think the best way is for us to find spaces to convene the right people in a room where they can actually create new knowledge. And that, I think, is our aspiration at the BIC.
Say it's September 2024. The Summit of the Future has been adopted. The outcome document is signed by heads of state. What would you like to see included in it? What would be your sort of top items, your wish list for an ideal version of a Summit of the Future outcome document?
I think it'd be great if we can acknowledge the proper role of state sovereignty. Now, it's not to undermine state sovereignty. I don't want responses in my inbox saying, how dare you question the very foundations of the UN. But in reality, there's no real such thing as sovereignty anymore. No country can close off its borders from all the rest and not be related to any other and survive in a meaningful way. And our global governance institutions are still built on the idea that political borders, geographic borders, actually define the international order. That's no longer the case. I think it'd be great if we can interrogate a little bit further the benefits and drawbacks of state sovereignty and where on that dial that issue should be. I think if we turn it down, then we would see a lot more local actors, regional actors engaging meaningfully. We would see the international community finding its niche, not taking over. I don't want an international authoritative body. I don't think that's the way to go. But it's trying to figure out what is the right balance. We haven't really questioned that in 79 years. And I think just an acknowledgement that this is a new reality of global interdependence and it has implications for how we conceive of global governance, that would be an amazing rhetorical success. I would love to see an Article 109 process be launched. Now, Article 109 is a provision in the Charter of the United Nations that says that a majority of the General Assembly can call for a convention where the charter would be revisited. Of course, the modifications to the charter would have to be agreed by the Security Council, but I see this as a little bit of a field of dreams moment, where if you build it, they will come. If we say in 2030, at the end of the SDGs, we have a moment to really rethink the role of the charter and the future of the United Nations in a reform kind of space, we might get some really interesting new ideas. I think we may not be attracting all those wonderful new ideas because the UN has lost a degree of its high esteem over the past decades. So perhaps if we call for this kind of a conference, you'll get really interesting insights, innovations, thoughts coming together. And yeah, whether or not they make it into a new charter is an open question. But I think if you were to ask any politician across the street about whether or not the UN as it stands today is the same UN that will exist 100 or 200 years from now, they'd probably all say no. So my question to them would be, well, how do we get to that thing that will replace it? Not replace it in an undermining kind of way, but be the next iteration of it. I think we have to start removing the taboo on charter reform in order to really envision what it is humanity needs. How do we get to that moment in 2124 when everybody has access to education and healthcare and food and water, when the environment is thriving and flourishing? How did we get there? Well, we didn't get there by avoiding talking about a new charter. I think Article 109 would be a really exciting innovation. The High-Level Advisory Board called for it narrowly in the area of Security Council reform. So let's start there. Anything, in my mind, to allow us a space for this conversation would be a real benefit to future generations, which ultimately is who need to be at the center of these deliberations, the people today who are suffering and the future generations who we're working for.
Hello, and welcome to Common Home Conversations. Today we're joined by Fergus Watt, coordinator for the Coalition for the UN We Need. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me, Kimberly.
So can you tell us about your work with the Coalition for the UN We Need?
Sure. The Coalition for the UN We Need began in 2017, and it was called something different. It was called the UN 2020 campaign. That name was selected because the year 2020 is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, and not wanting to let an anniversary go to waste, we had the idea that rather than just a birthday party for the UN, that the anniversary should entail a process of taking stock of the organization and consideration of ways to strengthen the UN system and global governance generally. So those were our goals. The pandemic had the effect of generating, among many small and medium governments, a recognition that multilateralism does need to be strengthened. And for our campaign, it was a bit of a silver lining.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. I suppose if you want to see a silver lining.
We found that there were a number of governments receptive to our message of using the 75th anniversary as a means for generating a broader dialogue on strengthening the UN.
You previously served as the executive director of the World Federalist Movement Canada for more than 3 decades. Can you elaborate on the World Federalism Movement and share more about this experience?
Sure. The UN 2020 campaign, now called Coalition for the UN We Need, or C4UN, began as a small project of the Canadian section of the World Federalist Movement. Just to explain what that's about, it's a long-standing NGO that was established really when the UN was established, and World Federalists seek to apply the principles of federalism to world affairs. And so strengthening institutions at levels above the nation state is very generally what the World Federalists seek to do. Examples of the kinds of things that are of interest to World Federalists. I mean, the EU, the European Union, is an example of institution building above the level of the nation state that has had a dramatic impact on politics in that part of the world and helped to keep, a group of nations that went to war twice in the 20th century working peaceably in a common market and trading environment. But also at a global level, Federalists are keen on strengthening the rule of law. We've had impacts on law of the sea, strengthening the rule of law and global governance for the oceans, where the Common Heritage Principle was a cornerstone of the Law of the Sea Convention. And more recently, World Federalists served as the home agency for a global coalition of NGOs that helped bring about the creation of the International Criminal Court, a court that holds individuals accountable for some of the worst human rights and humanitarian offenses, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, that sort of thing. And we had a fairly prominent role in that. So it's a huge goal, strengthening global governance. And the key is to find the pressure points for change and where you can, have an impact in getting from the nation state system of today to a better governed world of tomorrow.
I didn't know about the World Federalist role with the International Criminal Court. That's interesting. Now, when you look at your work at the WFM and the C4UN, a common theme emerges. A call for stronger multilateralism. Why is strengthening multilateralism essential?
Global cooperation is going to be essential to solve global problems like climate change and biodiversity loss and the pandemic. When World Federalists were initially organizing and around the time of the founding of the UN, the main problem that brought them together was war and peace. Over the decades since the founding of the UN, there's just been so many other issues that have come along, particularly environmental issues, but also pandemics, make it more obvious to so many people now that we really need a level of global cooperation. And the social solidarity that has been brought about by the pandemic, the recognition that we're not going to beat this pandemic until we tackle it globally. And what it does lead to is popular awareness of our interdependence. And I think that we're at a moment now when the widespread recognition of the need for improved multilateralism is growing. One hopes that's the precursor to, the follow-on political changes that we all know are necessary. And I think at a popular level, just notions of whether you call it cosmopolitanism or global citizenship or world citizen, it's just something that is kind of creeping into our consciousness and hopefully is a precursor to some of the political changes that are so necessary. The Secretary General has the power to initiate, and that's what he's done. The Our Common Agenda document is packed full of proposals for a stronger UN, and civil society is essential to these processes in helping shape consensus and build public support and support in parliaments for these progressive ideas.
At the end of the day, we have to remember that we're all Earthlings.
Yes, an Earth consciousness is where we want to be.
Our next guest today is Professor Arthur Lyon Dahl. He is president of the World Environment Forum and a former director of the United Nations. Very recently we spoke, and I also saw some things you've written. I quote you said, "Thank God for the pandemic." I don't think everyone feels the same, but I think you were looking at it from an environment point of view. Could you expand a bit more about it? Because I did post some of your information, and there were some comments that people said we shouldn't thank God for a pandemic.
I would agree, but it's a terrible tragedy. At the same time, sometimes tragedies have, you might say, a silver lining.
Never waste a good crisis. Don't waste it when it can have a very positive impact on climate change and energy security, and that's what we're trying to do.
And what the pandemic has demonstrated is something that environmentalists especially have been saying for many decades. We're dealing with a single world system, and we have to address global challenges at the global level. That would be why maybe we could be thankful in the future, in the long term, that we've learned a lesson that's been very hard to learn any other way.
Given the emerging axis of authoritarian countries, would it be more productive to start developing the urgently needed, effective, accountable transnational governance amongst the world's democracies, rather than the United Nations? Now, who'd like to come in on that? Yes, Arthur.
We addressed this at the end of our governance book, saying, ideally any intelligent community would call for a UN reform conference and bring about the changes needed. Clearly, the UN is paralyzed by these fatal flaws. We then said the alternative would have to be a UN replacement conference, where those willing governments who saw the need for it, if it was a great majority, could already create a better organization, get it up and running, give it a stronger independent funding mechanism, so it's not dependent on countries, any one country with global taxes funding it, global taxes, and leave out those few countries that refuse to take part until they finally, you sort of offer to buy out, and merge with the old structure or let it collapse. We went through this World War I and World War II already, and we're looking as though we're maybe heading towards another major crisis, which may mean that the whole system will collapse, and therefore we're saying, what do we rebuild after that process of crisis and collapse that we're looking in the eyes at the moment? That's the reality that we're facing. I sometimes say, well, maybe the best solution to climate change would be a nuclear winter for a few years to cool down the planet very quickly. And maybe in the longer term, that would be a better interest than any other solution that's tried at the moment.
We may be facing that more quickly than anyone would want to even consider. Harris.
I'm not going to go along with that last suggestion.
Ultimately, the mRNA vaccines are an example for that cell and gene therapy. I always like to say, if we had surveyed 2 years ago in the public, would you be willing to take gene or cell therapy and inject it into your body, we would have probably had a 95% refusal rate. I think this pandemic has also opened many people's eyes to innovation in the way that was maybe not possible before.
Are you ready for a new world order?
global taxes